So hi everyone, thanks for joining. It's nice to see a few familiar faces and then like a few new faces too. So we typically start these sessions for anyone who hasn't joined or been to some of our events previous this year. We usually do about one a month or something like that. But we usually start with some words just to give you permission to sort of settle into the space. So hopefully you kind of have a broad idea about what we're talking about, but the words just help ground us a little bit. So here are the words. So if there's one thing we all share in common as we navigate the transitional times we're in, is that there are not always an obvious and easy path to follow. Even the most experienced travelers in the regenerative space mention that they are continually finding their way, uncertain of what's around the next bend or over the next peak. It's an ongoing dance with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, moving before we think too much and thinking before we go too far. So although taking the first steps can often feel like the hardest, hearing about the journeys of others doing the same can be a vital part of our own. And we help each other towards a regenerative future, not necessarily as experts, but as parents, neighbours, colleagues, and citizens. And all of our stories are unique. So really, we just like to say that to sort of ground everyone in the space. And it's just a reminder, really, that this is a peer-to-peer forum. We're not interested in running this as in a sort of traditional model of, the gods telling the mortals right from wrong. So every voice is valued here and appreciated. Don't be shy with your questions, any reflections or provocations, no matter how naive or kind of ill-considered your inner voice is convincing you that those are. They're often, far more interesting and insightful than the definitive answers that we usually think we have. So we encourage you all to kind of be a part of the space, embrace that collective uncertainty together really for the next hour or so, if you can stay on for that long. And yeah, if you want to hold a space to speak on a topic for like 15, 20 minutes at a future session, do let us know, get in touch. And then in terms of just a little bit of housekeeping before I can hand over to our speakers today, which are Adam and Ellen. Like I say, we tend to run to about an hour, but we don't formally end the call like at the end. So you're welcome to kind of just drop in, drop out as you wish. So some of us will stay around a little bit after that, potentially, if the conversation keeps going. And then a reminder, really, that we've got another event coming up. We're actually trying a few different formats at the moment. So we do have something coming up, and John, correct me if my dates are wrong here, but I think the 28th of June, we're going to go on a sort of belated solstice walk around Knepp. So for those who don't know, Knepp's a rewilding farmland in southern England. So you're welcome to join if that's within reasonable distance of you. I appreciate not everyone's in the south of England, and it might not be reasonable travel distance, but we'll share more details of that in our newsletter in the next few weeks if you're interested.
And just to build on that, if people can get to a train station nearby, we will be kind of like doing car sharing and stuff to get there, should we need.
Yeah, great. And then, if not, if you can't make that, we're sort of interested in hearing about other local events that you might want to host or run, like anything. We were sort of thinking of doing something around the solstice. We're a little bit late on that. We're like a week after the solstice, but yeah, if anyone in this community wants to host something locally, please do. And we're happy to, like, if you sort of tag us on LinkedIn or wherever. Well, I'm only on LinkedIn, so but we'd be happy to sort of amplify that and promote that for you if you want to do that as sort of a local variation of what we're doing here. So we're keen on like sort of trying these alternative formats for future sessions. It doesn't have to just be about talks. We want to kind of exercise some different ways of knowing. So if you have any ideas or interests of anything that you're interested in, definitely please do let us know. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Adam, who's going to give us the first talk of the day.
Amazing. Cheers, Andy. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that all works. So if I put that in presenter mode, how's that? Is that everyone? Yeah.
No, it's all good.
Amazing. You might be able to hear some squeaking schnauzers in the background. Ellen, you've got horses. I've got schnauzers who are locked in a room. They're also locked in with my router. So they, if I blame them, if I suddenly stop sharing. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was going to say thanks so much for inviting me, but I think I invited myself originally. John, but the chance to come and chat today, it's a pleasure. I rarely do talks on my own. I do them with my business partner, Annie, who you can see in this picture. So this is a sort of comfort blanket of us at a talk not so long ago. I'm really excited to share some thoughts around what I've called regenerative origin stories. And I've never used that phrase before. So this is a real road test of some ideas around what that might mean. And it's around the use of cultural ideologies, myths, and narratives, and the roles that I think that they can play in a shift in thinking and mindsets and ways of living towards regenerative systems. Andy gave me permission to say right at the beginning that I am in some ways expert in some things, I suppose, but in a lot of this, I'm a total amateur, and a lot of what you'll see me talk through, I literally found out this week, and I share that as a kind of sense of
slides that are in there to make it easier for some of you that have already done that.
Is that someone's feed coming through? I share that in a kind of yeah, I'm not an expert in a lot of this. A lot of this takes me out of my comfort zone, but I guess that's the point of why we're here. We are here in some way. I wanted to start with a quick snippet of something I read recently by the economist Grace Blakely, which I loved, and I don't know if you know her, but she's always fascinating. Where she said, in a world that encourages us to see ourselves as isolated, competing individuals, any action that brings us together to support each other is a powerful act of rebellion. And I think that's partly why what this group is, or why I'm here as part of joining this group. And I can hope I can contribute to that vibe. And she evokes a topic in there, a narrative around competitive individualism that I want to talk about a bit more. I do an awful lot of talking about that theme. Who am I? You asked a couple of questions as ways of structuring all this, and I thought I'd use that to start with in terms of who am I and where have I come from. This is a quick summary of a few germane things about me that I've put together against the background of a murmuration, which is a motif I'll come back to quite a bit through this actually, and the reason it's there is my business, Annie and I's business, is called Starling, and in part it's because we're fascinated by the visual performance, but also the idea, the metaphor as well of murmurations. And I don't know if you know, and I really could talk about this all day and I won't, but one thing that is really fascinating to us about murmurations is that each starling is aware of 7 others around it, and each of those is aware of another 7 and another 7 and another 7 and so on, until the whole flock is so connected, and every movement, every change of direction and speed could be said to come from one bird, but equally from none. And I kind of find that fascinating. And in physics, it's called a critical transition, the move from a solid to a fluid state. So all these dots I've got here are really badly designed sort of ways of representing some of that. And this is just bits of me, I guess, in terms of particularly the work me, that I just wanted to really briefly touch on. The biggest blob, I guess, at the bottom is Starling, the work I do, which is primarily for brands, working in the insight space, doing cultural insight and strategy and futures work and all that sort of thing. And it's inspired by ways of thinking which come from history, sociology, cultural change and storytelling. It's very much not a psychological perspective on the world, and I'll come back to talk about that. I spent a lot of my first half of my career in consumer research, which was based in psychology, and I've moved and leapt into a different way of thinking. I lecture around cultural strategy at Bristol University, and I got into it so much that I decided to do a course, a master's, at the Cabot Institute for the Environment, which is at Bristol University, which is trying to understand how brands can think about their role in mobilizing people towards more sustainable or regenerative systems by thinking as themselves as cultural innovators and not just instigators of behavioral change or people that are shifting the formulation of their products. We are moving towards, hopefully, this idea of Starling contributing to a broader set of citizens and social organizations, and understanding what we can do from a cultural entrepreneurship perspective. But all of that together, in short, I think at the center of the murmuration is probably what interests me. And again, this is a sentence I've actually very rarely written down. I don't really know why, because it's always just been sort of there in the ether and behind the work. But it's my interest is in revealing the hidden power of history and culture in creating and recreating the world. And you know, that's kind of really the essence of what I want to talk about today, particularly in the service of regeneration. I again, this is another person that I have never put on a slide and talked to about since I've been about 18, because I studied history at university, and E.H. Carr, I don't know if any of you know, the great historian E.H. Carr, who wrote the seminal What is History in 1961, I think. This quote, I look back on it and I think it really absolutely sums up how I see and research the world. As I say, I started my career in qualitative research, which kind of left all this behind because it focused on what's inside people's heads. And I think this idea that E.H. Carr articulates here, the idea that we're all products of our environments, the ideas of the time, the language, and the ideas of others really speaks to me. And I think in many ways has been the lodestar that focuses a lot of my thinking. And it's a leap away from this. And it doesn't take a lot of to notice, certainly in my sphere, which is marketing, and kind of the corporate world, just how much framing of understanding people is codified by the brain, which I've kind of got this phrase of, you know, this idea of brain and behavior dominating the interpretation of people, their lives, and also how we might affect their attitudes and behaviors and choices to create some form of change. A lot of these points of view and ways of thinking are perfectly good. I just think they're quite narrow and myopic. And a lot of my work is trying to expand the ways of thinking about the world. And one of the big problems, I think, thinking about the environmental space, certainly from a corporate point of view, but I think this also pops up in policy worlds and beyond the corporate sphere, is that we see people far too much through this myopic lens, at the expense of seeing people as products, as interacting with their cultural settings and their, you know, a historical point of view and a socio-historical point of view, which can help open up a different way of seeing. So back to murmurations, you know, that what it represents for me, for us, I think, is a way to visually expand our frames of reference. It's actually, obviously, metaphorically, it decenters the human individual entirely, you know, as a living system. You know, that's partly why I've embraced this murmuration. And I very recently, and I can't believe I only just recently came across a poem in the brilliant Letters to the Earth compendium by Rob Cowan, called A Letter to a Starling. And I'd really recommend you look that up for lots of reasons. And I've taken a snippet of it just because I wanted to capture this idea of the collective power of starlings. I just thought all along you were drawing patterns for us to live by: community bird, collaborator, congregator, conversation bird, you accept a bird, come together bird, crowd bird. I thought that just captured so much of how I think about culture, you know, which I think of as this, in many ways, simply the space between us, the codes of communication which sync and unite us, and of collective action and what it can be. And I think a lot of this inspires me and has helped me move me towards what brings me here, I guess, this session, and some of the things and questions I want to put out there. Something I think about a lot is this, is the idea that we need to think it more and more. I talked about the limits of the psychological sort of behavioral way of thinking about the environment as a behavioral problem. I think we need to think a bit more as a cultural problem, and the need to transform, the need for transformation, not just to be seen as a technical or a behavioral challenge, but where we can apply cultural levers. And as this paper puts it, those levers tend to be the things like the foundational myths, the paradigms, the systems of meaning, which, as they beautifully put, open up collective horizons for actions. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about what some of those aspects of that are to me, and give some signals, I guess, to the group of what we might look for, what we might think about more, what we might talk about more. This is a screenshot of a few of the books that I think have inspired me to dig deeper into this and pull stuff out, and many of these aren't actually about the environment or regeneration at all, actually. And the purists among you will tell me that all these things on the left-hand side, ideologies, myths, narratives, meaning systems, stories, cultural expressions, they're not all the same thing. And you'll be right. But I think just for the purposes of now and today, I just think these kind of aspects of culture as units of analysis, for me, they all add up to, the stories that we tell ourselves, or the stories that are told for us. And I think I do a lot of work. My university lecturing is focused a lot on Douglas Holt's work. You might not be aware of him. He's one of the proponents of thinking about culture as a way to think about building brands. He's done a lot of work in the environmental space. He describes cultural expressions, which I think for me is one of the most accessible ways to think about this, as compass points organizing how we understand the world and our place in it, and what is meaningful, moral, and what we should strive for. And as I say, these aren't all the same thing, but the idea is that these things really do shape meanings through which people make sense of the world that are often taken for granted or ignored, or are in fact told for us, I think fascinates me. And this is part of the journey for me, looking more into this as a project in itself. Because I think one of the aspects of it, dangerously so, is that these stories often get told for us. This is a quote by Seth Godin, who I was listening to the other day, a marketeer with who actually was central to putting together the Carbon Almanac. I'm sure many of you have got that in your offices and at home. And in arguing for a systemic approach to regenerative practices, he emphasized the need to pay attention to this fact that very powerful industrial forces have narrated all our lives for the last 50 years with our permission. I just found that bit of language there, have narrated our lives for the last 50 years with our permission, as quite instructive and kind of needing for some extra careful attention. And this takes you back slightly to the beginning with Grace Blakely, that one of the most powerful ways in which I think this narrating our lives has come through has been through what's I call, or others call, the myth of personal responsibility. I'm interested in how this deep-rooted ideology, as called out by, so Dale is my university supervisor and friend, he calls it the most highly prized ideology of capitalism, the sovereign consumer. And it's really interesting, again, from my perspective, my industry, the world that I've kind of operate in, just how codified and sanctified that ideology is in the language we use. So, stepping back, it's kind of rooted in myths of rugged individualism, but it's shared in language around, the consumer is king. It's codified and expressed and manifest through carbon footprints and brain prints. We talk about changing attitudes, behaviors, and choices, the ABC of behavior change around the environment, and the say-do gap, which never is very far away from conversations about transformations related into the environment. These all very much express that kind of individualist take, and many argue will ultimately responsibilize the consumer for action and deflect ideologically attention away from systemic causes. One of the looking on the right here, one of the very early proponents of this, or stories that was told, was the Keep America Beautiful campaign against littering and pollution and things, which kind of brought the phrase Keep America Beautiful into the lexicon. But if you look back in terms of its origins and its origin story. It was funded by beverage and packaging corporations who clearly were producing copious amounts of plastic waste as part of a story to say, well, actually, this is something that you people can help fix, and therefore very little got changed at a systemic level and a production level. I won't talk too much about this one, but another one I'm fascinated by, which I've learned about recently, is just how much that your cooking with gas phrase, which I'm sure we're all aware of and familiar with, was brought into our language, our idiom, through gas companies back in the 1930s, originating with that phrase, now you're cooking with gas. And then hilariously, I won't play it right now, but I'll leave it here so people can play it later, a late 80s hip hop film, again, funded by the gas company, to talk about cooking with gas through the medium of rap. Oh, hang on. Oh, I'll play a little bit. Why not?
We can't hear it in case.
Yeah, we don't have the sound.
Oh, you can't hear it. That's well, that's I think quite fortuitous for you, to be honest. You have a look at it later when you can. Just
yeah, maybe share the link, Adam, and we can all have a hilarious.
I will do.
How great gas is.
But I think the what's interesting to me is the use of cultural artifacts and cultural forms to express, codify, manifest, and get them plugged into culture. And often, again, it's not something that we consciously become aware of, and then suddenly it emerges and becomes part of our shared language. And I started off talking about this idea of myths and origin stories, and just to zero in a little bit on this word myth, so I can get a little bit more expert on this, because I think Richard Slotkin is a guy. I don't know if you're aware of his writing. He's a historian, he's an American historian, and I've gone down a rabbit hole looking into some of his work recently, and he introduced me, his writing introduced me to the idea of myths as origin stories. And we think of myths as kind of on one level falsehoods, or attached to ancient or irrelevant cultures, but what he's talking about here is common stories that bind us together. He's analyzed 4 or 5 American myths that he says as a nation have in many ways been instructive for America. The frontier myth, or the myth of the Good War, for example, a couple he talks about. And they're stories unfolding from the past to the present, what he calls a usable past. They're used to understand the past. They're used to understand yourself and to decide or consent to what the right course of action is, and they get mobilized through popular culture. And that's a bit I find really interesting, is how popular culture for him plays such a huge role in expressing these myths, not as kind of declarative statements, but through their narratives and through their drama. So he'll point to Platoon and all that kind of huge groundswell of army and similar kind of films and cultural artifacts, which propagated that idea of the good war, the idea that America was a just and righteous intervener in foreign lands. Now, clearly, that had a shelf life, and I think the last decade or so perhaps has brought that severely into question, but you get the idea. And I think that phrase on the right is interesting. When you invoke myth, you recognize it. You think you've seen this movie before. You consent to the idea that this applies to the case before me. He actually also wrote a book called Regeneration Through Violence. I've not read that or looked into that, and I don't know what he means by regeneration there. So, but I'll stick that out there for people to look into. So, and this is where this is extraordinarily early phase thinking of mine is, in terms of what regenerative origin stories might look like. It's really just an experiment at this point, and a question, and we've been plotting out different zones or battlegrounds, really. People talk about narrative fights to win on these sorts of things, where we might want to understand the kind of deeper rooted myths and ideologies that do dictate how we live our lives, and where we might be able to tell some new ones. So the myth of personal responsibility, and how might we tell more distributed or collect stories of collective action, the perfectible self upgrade culture, you know, what does good enoughness look like? How could it be told as a story? Separation is one that's, I think, really important. And how does, if we want to move to a more Symbiocene-like era, what does indivisibility look like? Limits is clearly a story we need to tell better. And just the very final thing I wanted to talk about is time, because I think that's one that really fascinates me. I've gone down very deep rabbit holes in the last week or so. I don't have a clear story on, but clearly there's something underlying our certainly Western perspective and relationship with time that feels like, perhaps at this point anyway, I can sort of encapsulate as time is scarce, and what might it look like to think about as time as abundant. I won't go through all of these, but I just wanted to sort of flag a few bits of the murmuration that sort of are starting to settle and maybe form patterns here. I'll go from the bottom here. I won't cover all of them just in the interest of time. Boom, boom. I didn't know this, but it is the only noun in what is called the tier 8 of English language, meaning it's the most used noun in our language, just to show its kind of the obsession with it. And obviously with digital technologies, you really aren't very far away from a clock right in your face. There is a fascinating account. I'm moving, which way is it? Clockwise here. Bottom left, there's a quote by Adam Smith. I'm reading a fascinating account in Joseph Henrich's book on the on the weird worldview, where he talks about how what he calls market mentalities came into being off the back of building of clocks and clock towers in medieval times, and the imposition of what he calls the clock time mindset. And he quotes Adam Smith here to use the idea that, you know, he calls it an epidemic of clocks. When the greater part of people are merchants, they always bring probity and punctuality into fashion, and these therefore are the principal virtues of a commercial nation. So he's talking there, the idea of time and clocks very closely tied to the establishment of modern day market economies, and to cut a long story short, how they became symbols, but also structured market values and ideals of productivity, time as something to be monetized, made more efficient for profit purposes, values which brought progress, but they also clearly in so many ways have become extractive and exhaustive. Emma Dabiri, you might have seen in the books, is a brilliant writer on this, I think. She talks about, from a colonial perspective, how it wasn't always so. The language of time is money, saving time, buying time. These are colonial Western constructs. And if you look into Yoruban culture, for example, you get very different relationships to time. Afrofuturism is a really interesting sort of cultural history around talking about an abundance of time, where the present informs the past and the future informs the present. So completely different cyclical ways of thinking about time. I won't go through the rest here, but a gathering murmuration about time and how we might tell some new stories about it is high on my mind. And I think the most interesting one, frankly, currently, and final point really I wanted to make was, we don't just tell stories. I mean, that's the where you tend to think about how they're expressed, but we make them. And I think the 4-day week is a fascinating experiment in the making of a new story about time, because for all sorts of reasons, the well-being benefits have been already examined and stressed, and I think they are equally on the environmental front. There's a quote there from Juliet Shaw, who's the main academic understanding and experimenting with this. When you slow down time, when we don't all feel as time harried, then there are some very clear decarbonisation benefits, and we will start to feel the benefit from an environmental perspective. So there you go. There is a new relationship with time being tied into, hopefully, a more regenerative way of thinking. And I probably have taken up too much time, but these are just questions I'll leave here. I won't go through all of them. Maybe we'll come back to them. But the central one is, how might we get better at revealing the hidden myths and narratives we take for granted, but are degenerative, and how might we find origin stories that sit at the heart of new ones that we might call regenerative? Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. And don't worry about the time. We definitely treat that as
There's the irony there of feeling pressed for time at the end of that.
Just goes to show how ingrained the system is.
Yeah.
Also goes into curtailing our thoughts. That's brilliant. So what we tend to do is you might have questions, thoughts, reflections on that. Just hold those with you for now. We're going to actually move on to Ellen first so that we hear from her, and then hopefully there'll be enough time. Well, there will definitely be enough time to talk about whatever we think about afterwards.
Time is not real.
Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly not here, not on this Zoom call.
Okay, I'm just going to close. Sorry, I'm going to explain myself in just a second. I'm going to close the door. I'm in this wonderful office building, which is right in the middle of the Ashdown Forest, and I wasn't going to share this story, but I've just had to let a bee out. And earlier this morning there was a little wren got trapped in here, and it's all like glass windows, and the wren was like throwing itself against the windows, and I was working on my talk, and I had this like real sense of imposter syndrome, which is a common thread, but and then I was like, oh my god, that there's like an actual bird. So I've always lived in urban environments, and I've recently moved to the countryside, and well, recently in the last 5 years, but further and further into the countryside in the last 5 years. And so now I'm like being confronted with actual animalia. And the little wren, I felt too scared to pick it up. I was like, I don't know, it's like I don't know, it's weird, like touching an animal that's got like wings and legs. I felt really weird about it. And then it knocked itself out on the window, and it was like that on the floor, and then so I was like, okay, well, it was still alive, just knocked out. So I was like, well, this, like, I really have to deal with this now. And so yeah, I just picked up this cloth, picked it up in this cloth, and it came back, and it just like was just really still in this cloth, and it was looking at me, and I was just like, okay, so I can do this nature thing. But it was an incredible experience, and I just thought I would share it with you. So I don't really know why. Right, my talk. I suppose that's just like kind of something about my mindset going into this talk, is like I've just been trying to rescue birds. So I will share my screen. Here we go. It's not well, birds, theme of birds. But this one is about elephants. So a little bit about me. From a career point of view, I have mainly been working in the digital industry, and I've been working as a content strategist, helping teams and organizations, like vast dinosaur organizations and smaller organizations, with their language, trying to navigate the complexity of their language, doing their information architectures. Like I say, it's always been mainly in the digital sphere. And then, yeah, I've always had this real obsession with language. It's probably a task for a psychologist, psychotherapist of some kind, but I've always, since I was very small, been quite obsessed with nuances in language and what people mean by what they say. It might have something to do with being bilingual. Well, I grew up trilingual for a while and then bilingual. And yeah, so then a change happened in September last year. So I had 2 children and moved into the countryside. So I was no longer like housed in offices, and then obviously COVID, and remote working, lots of big changes. And I felt like I'd reached a bit of a clearing, and especially working for very large organizations like Virgin Atlantic, you know, big ones, where I just felt like I was just tickling at the toe of a dinosaur and nothing was happening. And I went to well, it was called the Happy Startup Camp, And I said to somebody, like, I feel like I've reached a clearing, and I want something to shift, but I don't know what it is. And I heard a talk at that camp by a guy called Kees Klomp, who's a Dutch guy. So Kees Klomp is an economist, and Kees Klomp's themes in what he talks about are, well, the meaning economy, the economy of meaning. So I've kind of hooked onto that as something that excited me, excited my ears. I wasn't sure what it meant at the time. And the other thing that he talked about was this sense of agency. So Kees Klomp is a professor of economics, and he talked about how his students were coming into university, and what he noticed before he even set to work on teaching them economics was that there was a great degree of anxiety. So existential anxiety, climate anxiety, you know, there's a lot of anxiety. And Kees is also very concerned in his work with the global narrative as well, with global economy. So he then began to talk about how we can help one another shift our narratives, because that's like the closest thing we have to us is other people. And I suddenly thought, like, I had a proper light bulb moment. I got the goose pimples again. I thought, I can do that. That's what I do. I help people shift their narratives. Because before that, I'd felt really a little bit dirty. Like I you know, go on yoga retreats and people are like, what do you do? I'm a, you know, and I'd be like, well, I help people with their brand narratives. I wouldn't feel all too good about that. So, but then suddenly this flipped my story, just suddenly like that, and I'm very grateful for that. So it started a trajectory of reading, and then I went down the rabbit hole of systems change, Donella Meadows, and all of the above. And so here I am. I'm like in the rabbit hole now. It was only very recent. So at the same time, basically this talk now is going to focus in this area now, how we go from our individual narratives to community narratives. Whereas in my wider career, I often work with organizational narratives. This is like my point of fascination, particularly in terms of system change or points of intervention. There's basically two aspects to language. There's this kind of conflict that I face all the time in my work. So shared language is often too slippery for groups to hold on to with confidence. So that goes in direct conflict with this wonderful thing that Donella Meadows says. The first step in respecting language is keeping it as concrete, meaningful, and truthful as possible. So in my work, I'm always flipping between those two difficulties, helping people grasp hold of words, knowing full well that they're slippery. And okay. So we're going to do an experiment. I'll talk you through it. It's going to be quite short and easy. Don't panic. So we're going to, each of us individually, just in your mind's eye, imagine an elephant. Right, just imagine an elephant for a moment. Okay, right. Hopefully you should have a semblance of an elephant in your mind's eye. So now into the chat, don't send it yet, into the chat, just type the words into the chat before you press send, and I'll say go in a minute. Type some words that define that elephant for you, the elephant that you have in your mind's eye. Okay, so you should have some words in the chat box. And oh, I can see some furious type. It's not an essay, John. Okay, are you ready? Press send now and let's see what these elephants look like in words. Okay, I can already see some common language here, thankfully. We've got grey, rough, wrinkles, tree trunk legs, trunk, huge. Okay, so we've got some huge, we've got flappy ears. Interesting to see what, okay, Dumbo, so it's a character. Heavy, huge, Mughal period painting manuscript, lovely. And so we've got some commonalities and we've got some idiosyncrasies. And now you might look at some of those idiosyncrasies and go like, oh, I like that elephant. I like the sound of that elephant. You might flip what your vision of that elephant is in your mind's eye. Oh, we've got baby elephant. Weird toenails. Okay, what does this say about people? Right. Smile. We've got a happy elephant. Oh yeah, memory, lovely. So that's more of a kind of a quality. So right, I'm just going to show you this. So this is a picture of an elephant from the 13th century. So you can see from our understanding of elephants that we have these commonalities, we have idiosyncrasies, but I should explain this picture. So this picture is from a Wired article, which I really enjoyed reading. There's a reference there. When I send it around later, you can have a look at it. Highly recommend it. It's about this whole trajectory in time where people believed that elephants didn't have knees. And so there's like a whole history of depictions of elephants with or without knees, depending. So this guy wrote a 12th century bestiary, how do you say it? Who declared that elephants did not have knees, and then people copied that in time. I don't know what that says, something about AI maybe. But anyway, there's a thing about elephants. Right, to bring that back to, let me just, now where is my cursor seems to, there we go. Right, what we can learn from this, perhaps, and something that I've been learning in this journey now, is to include the real thing. It was interesting that you asked for a landmark at the beginning of this conversation. It's like, you know, we're all people suspended in our Zoom windows. So it was really interesting to like, what do you anchor your sense of reality to? So it could be an item, a resource, an area, people in the conversation. So the thing that you might learn in the elephant context, if you're trying to depict a real elephant or work with real elephants for whatever reason, you would need to go and see an actual elephant in order to be able to define it. So that's just my interpretation of working towards the concrete, as Donella Meadows was saying. Okay. So I think there was a connection here that was really strong for me when Adam was talking about the E.H. Carr quote. I also did E.H. Carr at school, and I was lucky enough to discover the thing of bias from a really early age, and to be like, what do you mean? Like, there's no such thing as truth. Anyhow, so E.H. Carr, he mentioned in that quote, language and the environment, and those two things being what shapes our reality. Or that's my interpretation of it anyway. So on a recent project that I've been working on, I've learned there was real emphasis on this, listen to the land. We're including the land as a stakeholder in our work. And the land has a place at every table that we sit at to discuss the project. Schumacher College have been running research experiments, sending people out to listen to rivers. So much stuff gets done in boardrooms, skyscrapers, London, like removed from the actual physicality of the place. Listen to the old phone box, listen to the space. What is it telling you? There is a vocabulary that comes from the reality of the thing. As I was looking up the quote, "The map is not the territory," the other day, and there was I stumbled upon a detective's website, and the detective was saying it would be absolutely ridiculous to try and solve a crime having never visited the crime scene. So I thought that's actually quite a good analogy for what we're doing here. It's like you can't work on a project on the land, or you can't work on a project in an old phone box without visiting the old phone box. Okay. Oh. So yes, hold on to your hats. There's another diagram. So this is, we've done the mind's eye experiment, which is at the center of this idea I have of what shared language, the anatomy of a language body. So in this journey, I attended a course at the School of Systems Change, which I would highly recommend. And they talked about nested systems, and I did this experiment to see how language or shared language might look if it was a nested system. And it seems to be working quite well for me. So we're just going to be focusing on the vocabulary ring in the next few bits of my talk. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk about this other lovely metaphor that seems to be working well for me. So my departure from only working on digital projects was first with an arts organization. And the arts organization had been dormant. It had its heyday. So it had its big flame, the story, the narrative. It had lots of funding once upon a time. And then the funding disappeared. COVID happened. It was an arts organization for theatre, for puppetry, in fact, called the Puppet Centre Trust. And and it went into a kind of dormancy, and lost sight of its I guess it's shared language. But everyone still had this spark. Like everyone who was involved was still had a little flame on the inside, but it was just a case of bringing that flame together. So in working together towards finding the shared vocabulary and the DNA being mission, vision, purpose, all the like those concrete statements that might hold a group together. Yeah, so we use this metaphor of like just gently putting sticks on the embers to bring the flame, to coax the flame back to life. And sometimes these, especially in group work, we were talking about it being slippery earlier, it can be delicate like an ember. The fire could go out. It's like, is there enough energy in it to like place a few sticks on it? And sometimes I think that in the absence of funding, particularly, your vocabulary and your shared sense of where you're going together, that might be your purpose. It could be, we called it spark for them, because people get hung up on like, what is a purpose statement and what should it be and what shouldn't it be? So like what that spark is the fundamental currency to keep something alive, particularly in the absence of funding. So we're just going to have a little look at vocabulary in the context of a project that I've recently been working on. So I was invited by a fairer society to work on this amazing project, and it's become quite close to my heart now, a regenerative project. And it's called Bowden Pillars Future, and it's based in Devon near Totnes, right next to Totnes, practically, well, in Totnes. It borders, as you come out of the train station, the land is right there in front of you, going up the hill. And they have 150 acres, I believe, somewhere between 125 and 150 acres of land. And that land, that group of people wanted to find a shared language. So as you can see from the logo, there's a forest, so that it's going through a temperate rainforest regeneration project with the Devonshire Wildlife Trust. It's on the site of an old farm. There is going to be a village, an eco-village built there. There's a community surrounding it. But what they needed was a shared language. The language of farming is a very different language from the language of forestry, and the language of forestry is a very different language from the language of building an eco-community. So they needed to find a shared vision that incorporated all of those. So I started off, I'm just going to rattle through. I see that the time is ticking. Time. Am I all right? Andy, is it okay time-wise?
Yep. No,
Yep.
carry on. We're not,
All
we're
right.
not worried about it.
Yeah, just shout if it gets, if I'm like getting too close. So, so I started off, so in the digital industry, a stakeholder interview might include questions like, what does your CMS look like? What's your availability like? Blah, 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 blah. You know, what are your motivations for doing, what triggered this project? And so flipping onto a project like this, those questions become very different. And my intention, I suppose, with the stakeholder interview was really to discover each individual's intention. And so what I love to do is this language harvest. And a language harvest isn't so much a record of the things that were said, but more finding where the commonality. So it's in the elephant, it was like, there's a trunk, it's gray, it's wrinkly, it's the most common language. So it's like, what does this elephant look like to all the different people that are associated with the project? And it's nice to get individuals talking about it by themselves, because they might say things that, you know, they might not say in front of another, the rest of the group. But then I found these words, place, sense of place, grounding, hope, intention. So there's these lovely sort of catch-all words. So like with the elephant, it's like the trunk. And then we can go deep. We can find that as a starting point for getting more concrete with our language. So I'm just gonna show you this little technique that I've used before for working my way through complexity. So one of the people that I sort of discovered this from was a lady called Abby Covert. She wrote a book called How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And I was lucky enough to go to one of her workshops. And she basically said, if there's a mess, break everything down into nouns and verbs. So, but not to say it was a mess, because it was actually quite clear. But this connected to something I heard in the School of Systems Change, which was focus on the verbs. If you're trying to find a point of intervention, focus on the verbs. And I wasn't entirely sure what that meant at the time. It felt quite abstract, but doing it here started to really bring the connections to life. So you can really see that the language starts to become more concrete, and the relationships become more concrete and more active when you start to look at. So the community works on the farm, or the farm employs the community. The temperate rainforest increases biodiversity. There's such a thing as agroforestry. So you can really start to see the ecosystem come alive with language using the nouns and the verbs. So this is this isn't actually them. This is a different group. This is ladies at UX in Brighton, although there is a man in there, I realize, but that's anyway. So we basically use wool and we role play. So people take on different characters. So there's one person is the forest, one person is the village school, and we use wool to find connections between those things, and those wool connections help bring out the language. So we had children from the school talking to the forest saying, I want to play in you. So it was a really lovely activity that we did, and really helped get a sense of the ecosystem. So then, hang on a sec. Yeah. So then another way to break open the language. So we have big words. So we had the word hope, we had the word place, and then to get closer into what it is, like what kind of place, what kind of hope. So then people put down their understanding, what kind of elephant. People put down their understanding, and we talked about each of these definitions. Well, it's not an eco-village because it also contains a forest. It's not regenerative living, because it also contains a forest, or regenerative living is still too big a word. It doesn't mean enough. So we actually settled on the idea of it being a neighborhood, because the neighborhood also includes nature, and it includes all the elephants. Oh. It includes all the elements. So we're just going to briefly go here, and you'll see now how this kind of choice in language made its way through into the overarching messaging. So there's a neighborhood taking root. So that was just being inventive with our language there, where nature, farming, and community are growing together. Hang on a sec. So let's meet there so you can see. Oh, hang on. So if we go back to connects and meets in the middle there, that's one of the big verbs. So you can start to piece together the DNA of your language, like the vision and the mission, from getting really specific about the vocabulary, and taking root as well. So yes, so Danella, back to Danella. So the second step, so we've done the first step. The second step is to enlarge that language. So if the Eskimos have so many words for snow, it's because they've turned snow into a resource. So we broke open this idea of like, you know, what's happening. It's not being built, it's not being created, it's taking root. And that's really specific language. So that's my interpretation of what's going on here. It's like, it's actually completely specific to what Bowden Pillars do as a group, as a team. Okay. So I wondered whether, just as a final task, whew, it is getting close, isn't it? A final task, you might just look around you and see if you were to be specific. So there might be something in your environment that looks like it has been regenerated in some way. Maybe it's a cup of tea that you've put in the microwave. There is such a thing in hospitals known as the food regeneration room. I have a photograph of it somewhere. Anyway, so something in your environment that has been regenerated, and so it's this idea of like breaking it open to be more concrete about it. What kind of regeneration? And then just put it in the chat. Feel free to press send if it's in the chat. Whoa, psychic regeneration. Lovely. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with this phrase: language is our map towards each other. And that is it from me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Andy, very much for inviting me to do so. I am glad you did. I was a little bit worried that I wasn't ready to talk about it. So yeah, great. And John as well, particularly, yeah. And thanks for the encouragement. Great.
No, thank you, Ellen. Thanks very much. And thanks to Adam again as well. We definitely encourage people feeling, well, we don't want you to feel uncomfortable, but I guess there's no harm in being in an environment where it's okay to not have all the answers, I think, basically. So we are on the hour if anyone does need to head off, but we normally just kind of, if there's a conversation to be had and people still want to stick around to have it, then we let it carry on. So, but if you do need to disappear, feel free. So it's kind of open to the group now, really. We don't have a formal structure to this as much as, did anyone have any sort of thoughts, reflections, questions, anything you wanted to bring?
I have an initial reaction across both talks just as they were unfolding. And then when Ellen's came later, I really got into this sense that myths and cultures and everything are essentially built out of millions or billions or trillions of conversations and language used over time, and they accrete. And then to the point Adam's talking, sort of like you're kind of like you're sitting on top of that bank of language when you're born and you start there. And then Ellen's is almost at the other end of the scale and going, but if you want the culture to be different, if you want those conversations to, if you're thinking about people born in 20 years' time, you're going, how can we make enough different conversations start to happen now, and find the language and the terms and the shared things that are actually not just reacting to that, the scale of all the language that's gone before, but going, even just being together with like small communities like this, or where you live, or whatever it happens to be, and just using the words and forms of language enough that it starts to change things in small ways and slowly.
One thing that I think all of this connects to something I was thinking about, because I too have a bit of a geeky brain for language, because I used to be an interpreter, and it made me think of translation and interpreting, because if you don't have language for concepts, you can't talk about them. And different languages have different blind spots. And it's interesting, if we are doing regenerative work, moving and learning between local and more further away for the removed concepts, the work of translating those concepts is its own niche.
There's one phrase that has been on my mind for a long time, but I cannot seem to find a better alternative, but I think it's deeply problematic, is this term cost of living. And I really don't like it. Just that there's a price to be alive. And it's telling of a lot of the way in which our economy is working. And I think also maybe distracts us from other things, but I'm yet to find some other reframing of it. And so these like very ubiquitous terms that probably there's loads more of, that we don't question because they're normalized and parroted by a lot of politicians or media. But yeah, I'm always like inspired by these types of events where we're thinking of new ways to frame things. So that's one that I would very much welcome alternatives to, if you have them.
I definitely feel like there's a project to be done if it doesn't already exist, which is a lexicon of, or a dictionary of how you can use a more regenerative framing of things. I sort of tried to start one myself, but I didn't get very far with it. And I'm not really a wordsmith by profession, at least. So I'm sort of handing that out to the group if anyone wants to start one, or even collaborate on starting one. There's a Notion page somewhere waiting for us all to sort of find out what language shifts we think would be really beneficial.
I'd love to see, like, when Ellen talked about, and I loved just the description of the language harvesting exercise. Like, how could we do like an asynchronous version of that to begin with, and then just everyone who's been to one of the first 5-6 sessions, if there's a way that we can kind of like harvest that stuff and begin to, just find that shared language where we can sort of go, oh, so when people say this, we seem to be in this direction.
I guess the elephant in the room is the elephant in the room is, and when I was talking about cultures, I was using language like shared and being in sync and common. Yet that obviously plasters over quite a lot of fragmentation, which is the reality of our shared world. It's not everyone on the same page. And I guess that's one challenge that sits in my mind all the time, which is, are we talking about lots of shared languages, therefore, or is there, on this regenerative space, truly a need for and there probably is a need, but is there a likelihood of getting to a shared language and shared set of ideas that can motivate people? That the reality of the cultural fragmentation, which is out there for good and bad reasons, is an imponderable, or one that is being pondered, but I struggle to find any kind of great answers to.
I think one of the attributes of language being a kind of spontaneously, not spontaneously, but it is an emergent thing. So it does evolve with culture and with effort. So there is that element of negotiating terms between each other is part of language. So I don't think aiming for a static future of a common shared language is even realistic to consider. I think it's like tending a garden. You have to keep working at it, and it will keep moving in a direction. It's just more the direction that we need to be aligned on.
I think as well, it's useful to think about the fragmentation as an opportunity, not just as barrier. That, there are almost, sorry to say this, but it's where I come from, cultural anthropology. There are pre-language notions about what is driving us, driving our culture and so forth. And then we're all in our groups interpreting those in different ways. But the fact that actually we now live in a moment where there are many interpretations floating around opens more space for us to grow an interpretation and give it a chance to, spread.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I'm seeing, which I think is both ironic but also amazing, is Heather's picture, which says "enough said." It feels weird. It's too much of a coincidence for that to be not, unintentional.
Yeah, the universe being in sync. I was just going to say on that topic, so in that outer circle of story, message and story, where the flame can like catch fire or be passed on, there's a lovely, well, it's a bit bonkers, but there's this book called Swarmwise, and I keep forgetting, Jan Falkviga, something is, I haven't got it quite right in my head. You can look it up, Swarmwise. And that book talks about how the power of a very basic message can really catch light. So again, in the absence of like any other currency, if you can distill your message down to something that is viral, but not in the social media sense, but viral as in people can really grasp it and run with it, then that's a really powerful thing. And that was another affirmation to me as well on this journey, that actually the power of language can incrementally shift that the paradigm, really. It's an interesting book for anyone that's working with community groups and wants to get a message across.
Yeah, there's something interesting in this point. I think, Indy, you've kind of raised it, which is, and probably others actually. I think, Misha, you sort of said something similar, which is this idea of, it feels like there's a tension in the world between, let's just say, there's a challenge of truth, finding the truth, and it on a sort of popular cultural level. But then there is this positive lean towards multiple ways of knowing. I guess what you call like, what the academics would call epistemological breakdown or something, or plurality, something like that, right? So lots of different ways of meaning. But that does lead to this, or maybe it doesn't. I'm trying to hold this together. Like, does that lead to a breakdown of truth or not? So when we see some extreme events happening like in certain political spheres, is actually that just a kind of a natural consequence of people finding their own ways of knowing and their own ways of meaning, and it can have those kind of dramatic effects. But I haven't got the answers to that. I just want to throw that in right at the end.
It's a good point. The other thing that I have found interesting reading the arguments of Richard Slotkin, who thinks a lot about America, but other people have said something similar, is that a lot of the ownership of powerful stories and language comes from the right, because the left is this is a very broad brushstrokes division, but it sort of works, that the left is concerned with facts and critique and the right and wrong and of analyzing things, and that's not belief doesn't live there typically. Belief lives somewhere else, which is a challenge, I guess. And Naomi Klein's got a lovely phrase around the right doesn't get the facts right, but it gets the feelings right. It's a similar difficulty politically in terms of who's good at this stuff, which tends to often be the case. So back to your question about truth is an interesting one.
To me, this feels like hijacking at most. Like, it just feels like we have this capacity in our mind, like our bodies and brains have the capacity to be swept away by emotion. And there's just like the right is really good at hacking that mechanism and using it usually to achieve nefarious ends rather than anything positive. Because there's a phrase that I really like to use for myself and for others is, what do you not need evidence to believe? So when you hear something and it immediately resonates with you, that's kind of the area that you do need to double check.
So would you say, Misha, like, is it positive or negative, or maybe we can't make a judgment claim on this, that emotional hijacking is actually quite a good thing or not?
It's something that exists. It's like it's a thing. It's a feature of the human being. And it's just, what Adam was saying is like the left doesn't seem to focus much on that. But the right capitalizes on it. And that, I think, politically is creating challenges. But the existence of it is undisputable, I think. A lot of us are rational or more rational than others, maybe, or maybe we like to see ourselves that way, but everyone is susceptible to being hijacked. And it's more a matter of like self-awareness of it, and also how can we use it for good to kind of orchestrate ourselves around common goals, like not destroying the planet.
So to extend that idea, just with an example, so Helen and I live in the state, we started a little wildlife group as part of, just that's one of the things we do. If you could use in the same way that you've got that kind of like beliefs and myths, but in a positive way, so you say, so because we've begun looking after the communal spaces in a way that respects wildlife, every time you see a bird, you did that. Every time you see, nature becomes the sort of, like, even if it's true or not, you go sort of like, how do I start stimulating the belief around the fact that suddenly everyone's confirmation bias is leaning into the fact, oh, I saw some extra nature. Now, it might be nature that was there yesterday or the week before or the month before or the year before, but just finding ways to tie the action that they have taken or not taken into the kind of the evidence in front of them to go, oh, look, I now believe that we are making a difference, becomes... Is that the same sort of thing?
It's interesting because it highlights the relationship, which I think is really powerful. And that's something about feelings. Like, rationality is often conceived as accurate, but that's a complicated thing. But one of the things feelings do is they encompass a much bigger swathe of things all at once. But that's also about systems, about talking about relationships and actually focusing on the relationship, not the things. So you might not even actually have to focus on the relationship in an untrue way. It's like, maybe we just need to get better at focusing on the relationship. Like, what's the relationship between you and nature? But yeah, like, the white lies are helpful.
I was thinking also, just jumping back a bit, you talk about creating a shared language for regeneration. Maybe there's a need for a propaganda department. That's what we're really good propaganda, whatever that means. You frame it that way with all the virality and emotion and myths and symbolism that propagandists are good at. I don't know. Does anyone know any propagandists? That was a word I didn't use. It's totally in the ballpark of what all of those myths and ideologies and all the rest of it. That's basically that. Point me in the direction of anyone or anything doing that. I'd love to find out more about that. Maybe we create it.
I suppose it does hark back a little bit to the guests we had earlier in the year. For people who weren't there, the purpose disruptors work. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't call themselves propagandists, but there's an element of how do you subvert advertising so that it can truly work for broader socially and environmentally valuable means. And for anyone who didn't see that, we probably got a recording of it if you want to hear from trying to think. But yeah, we've got that on YouTube somewhere.
We do, which is where this will be on YouTube as well. I might stop recording.